those links will be put in there as well. But basically, the reason this is on GitHub and the reason this isn't a PDF is because this is supposed to be quite interactive. And so all of these slides that we have here are in Jupyter notebooks using Python code, because I think it's quite important when you present these things to have them in a way that other people can use them. And so this isn't just a bunch of interesting mathematical ideas that may actually work. They are things that you can actually play with and explore yourself. And so basically what this has in it is using a tool called MyBinder. So how many people have used Python before? A few. And MATLAB? R? Wow, quite a diverse group. I'm trying to think of what other major... Nime, has anyone used? No one. Okay. And tools like MyBinder, Docker. Okay. So hopefully you'll learn a lot today. That'll be good. So basically, all of these things are done in something called MyBinder, which is basically this open source, open platform for having reproducible analysis online. And so basically, the idea here is that you can, if you write a paper and you do a bunch of complicated analysis, you have 2 paragraphs in your method section that represents 6 months worth of work. And so it's very unlikely that someone can take that 2 paragraphs and actually reproduce all of your results. And so what this enables you to do is say, here's the code, and it's not just the code, but it's the whole setup you need to actually run it. And you can start running this code by just clicking on one of these links. And MyBinder will open up the links for you so that you can change the values in the field, you can rerun the code, you can change the input, and everything works. And so you have all the right dependencies, you have all the right versions of everything, and it should just seamlessly work. And so we can click on the first slides here, and it takes a little while, but then you'll see all the internet here might not be very quick.
Which one are you? Because the MaxIV visitor is slightly more...
Slightly faster?
I think so, normally.
Okay.
At least for me.
This one?
Yeah.
And what's the password?
MaxLab 2015. Very active.
No spaces or anything? Nope. Okay, seems to work. So yeah, that seems to load quicker. And that you can actually just go here and click on this button there with the chart on it. And now you have exactly the same slides running on your machine as I do. And they're not just slides, they're actually interactive. So I think the first few slides don't have too much.
I have code.
What? Yeah, so you have code, and in order to switch into slideshow, you need to click the little chart button that says Enter Rise. So this button here. And then it will switch into a Rise slideshow. But it's the same content in the code form or in the slideshow. And what's sort of the primary advantage of using this is that we won't get too much into this yet, but that we'll see here, how much video does a GoPro make in an hour? And you have all of the formulas here, and you can change the numbers. And so if you wanted to do 60 frames a second instead of 30 or 120, you could just do that and rerun the code and get new results. And so almost every one of the figures is actually made like this, so you can really see what went behind it. But now we'll actually get started with the lecture. That was just more so you can kind of see what the setup for this environment is. Reload. And sort of be able to use these things a little bit yourself without having any of the set up. So it seems to be working.
Go to the next slides and back. To me, I have the same. Just go to the back, forward and back.
Ah, and then it works.
Yeah, fantastic.
Normally this works without any issues. I don't know why the browser is being so awful today.
Too many people are accessing it.
Maybe. I mean, I've always used this on very good internet connections, and so potentially the slowness of the internet causes some issues. Okay, so now it appears to be working fine, and this is now the first slide. And so a lot of the topics we'll cover today, we'll cover in quite a bit of detail, but nothing compared to the actual raw material. And so here are a bunch of links that I'd recommend you look at if you're more interested in these topics. And so they sort of vary from reproducible science and sort of why that's important and coming up with better examples for why it's a huge problem that scientific studies aren't reproducible, to sort of what Google does internally, sort of how their tools are structured, the developments that they've come up with, and then some slides and presentations that show sort of how they dealt with these problems, because as we'll mention later, most of these issues are not invented by scientists. Most of these issues have existed for a long time, and we're just trying to apply the best practice solutions to get good results out of it. There's also courses at many universities or online about these sort of tools. So at UC Berkeley, ETH, and a number of other places. We'll have a little bit about cluster computing. We won't go in too much detail here. So I assume most of you are at institutes that have some sort of cluster resources. And has anyone used those resources before? No one. Okay. So we won't go into the details because unfortunately the way they're set up is usually different at every institute. And so if you know how to use it at one, it doesn't mean you know how to use it at the other. But we'll try to cover some of the basic principles for that. We'll talk a little bit about sort of databases and then cloud computing at the end, just because they're sort of important concepts to have a feeling for. So in terms of the outline, the first thing we'll cover is really the motivation. So what are we trying to do here? Then some brief kind of computer science principles. And so why are these things important at all? And why are these problems actually difficult to solve? Because what you often see, particularly among physicists and chemists that program a lot, is that their code runs too slow, and then they just parallelize it, whatever that means, to make it run faster. And there's a huge number of problems you can run into when you do this. And so being aware that it's a very complicated task, and if you're not careful, you can end up producing completely nonsensical results. Then a bit about sort of the organization and sort of how are queues and clusters organized, what sort of things are we trying to do with this. And this kind of covers small data. And so all of these things fall in the category of like, what have people been doing since the 70s to handle processing tasks? And then we can make the jump over to sort of what is big data and how can we do that? And what are the differences between sort of small data and big data approaches? And so when we look at the motivation of this is of course quite broad, and the people who are doing the practical tomorrow will hopefully get a little bit more detail into this. But it's really to be able to go from, this picture of a bunch of bone samples to the sort of pop news, pop science article that says science says ice cream is good for bones. And sort of like what happens in between here so that you can go from this image of a bone to this pretty broad statement about health. And sort of kind of appreciating what kind of analyses need to be done to actually start to quantify the things that are important and then do the statistical analyses. And so the real focus of the big data part is that, if you're doing this for one image, 100 images, or 1,000 images, it should look exactly the same. It shouldn't be more work for you. It shouldn't require manually clicking on a bunch of things, and it should be fairly easy to do. And so it's how can you build up your analysis and build up your studies so that it's not 10, 100, or 1,000 times harder to do larger scale studies. And sort of what we see, and this is sort of from synchrotrons, is that you have sort of the breakdown between a standard scientific experiment. So this is fairly general. The next slide is more specific. And so when you have an experiment, the first part is really experimental design. So how do you pick what variables are important, pick the samples, pick the measurement technique, sort of design what experiment you're trying to do, assemble the hypotheses, make sure you're using the right techniques, know what sort of analyses are possible. The second part is then kind of the management. And so where do you get the samples from? How do you prepare them? What do you do to actually load and store and keep track of all the data? Then the third part, and this is really the experimentalist part, and this is the acquisition of the sample data. And so this is where you actually bring your samples, in this case to a synchrotron, have them measured, and then collect all of your data. And the final part is really post-processing. And so once you've collected all this data, how can you get something valuable from your experiment? And so it's not just some interesting experiments that you've done, but it's actually a full analysis that says, for example, ice cream makes bones stronger. Oh, this doesn't look very good. Anyways, I'm not sure why that's so small. Okay, I guess it's going to remain quite small. Anyways, so the breakdown for these different steps has sort of changed over the years. And so when you look at sort of synchrotron experiments or imaging synchrotron experiments that were done in 2000, you had maybe not an even split, but a fairly, experimental design was usually a bit quicker. Measurements themselves took a very long time. Management was a reasonable amount of time, but not very long compared to the experiments. And then post-processing, which took almost as long as the experiments, but not quite as long. And sort of what trend we've seen is that this sort of measurement time has vanished. And so when you look at sort of the new detectors that are able to collect gigabytes of data a second, you can now collect enough data to analyze for your entire PhD in 10 seconds. And so this has really shifted the paradigm for what you focus your time and energy on, from sort of how do you do the measurements well to how do you do the post-processing well. Because if you look at this graph, you would say people doing PhDs at synchrotron should be computer scientists. They shouldn't be physicists because most of the work is computer science. And very little or almost invisible portion of the work is actually physics. Of course, that's not completely true because there's lots of understanding you need to have in order to do that post-processing well, but that there's been this drastic shift from the experiments really being the crucial part, how do you make your detector work well, how do you align your sample, to how do you analyze your data. And so at least in the case of my PhD, I think we spent around a month collecting all the data, maybe a month and a half, and the rest of the time was spent analyzing it and trying to come up with meaningful values to extract from it. So when we look at sort of the big data motivations, there's kind of three different types of problems we run into. So the first one is just really big data sets. And so when you're dealing with very large image sets, this becomes sort of a critical issue to manage well. In one example from sort of like the Human Brain Project, which we'll mention, you have a cubic centimeter scanned at micrometer resolution. And so that's a huge amount. Each data set is 1,000 by 1,000 by 1,000 micrometers. And each one of those blocks represents sort of 1,000th of the analysis that you're trying to do. And so there's a huge amount of data that you need to collect. You'll never be able to fit all of it in memory. And so you require approaches that are able to scale to this size very well. And so, as many of you have seen, sort of the computers that you have today, I mean, this laptop has 8 gigabytes of memory. Maybe a good laptop has 16. A good desktop might have 256. The most memory I think any computer I've seen has is about 4 terabytes, but that costs, I think, around $30, $40 an hour to use. So it's quite expensive, but basically you'll always be limited in how much memory you have access to. And then when you have these machines with lots of memory, you have a lot of different cores and CPUs that are trying to use this memory, and so even per CPU, you often don't have that much. Drive, network speed become a limiting factor, and if you crash, you sort of lose everything. And so you'll end up writing a bunch of sort of checkpointing code. Is this task done? Is everything saved? And then we can resume if that's already there. And so it's kind of a very challenging problem. The next type of problem you run into is the sort of many data sets. So for genome scale studies, when you're trying to do very interesting sort of biology projects, and you want to be able to scale to thousands of samples, you want to analyze all of the samples exactly the same. With dynamic experiments, you could have time series where you're looking, from the range of sort of milliseconds to hours over sort of material science processes like coarsening or something that are taking place, and you want to study the dynamics of those. And so you can have thousands of different measurements so that you cover that whole time range well. Animal phenotyping, which is sort of similar to the genome scale studies, but where you have a number of different full animals you're trying to measure. And in this case, it's a project from sort of Pennsylvania, where they have thousands of 328 gigabyte data sets. So that's not only very large data sets, but a lot of them. And then if you look at sort of where we work more often today, that radiologists in Switzerland make a petabyte of scan data every year. And this gets stored in different hospitals. And so to analyze these data sets is a big data sort of problem. And then the last task is probably something you're also very familiar with, these idea of exploratory studies. And so a lot of times you measure data sets without really knowing what you're looking for. And so when you saw the imaging experiments or the imaging presentation before, a lot of the examples were from paleontology or fossils, where you have a rock and you're not really sure what's inside, but you want to be able to segment and extract and play around with these things as quickly as possible so that you can figure out if there's even something interesting to analyze inside or not. And so you don't want to spend 40 hours processing data if there's nothing useful inside it. And so how can you make it very efficient to get feedback quickly on the kinds of analyses that you're doing, come up with maybe interesting hypotheses to test, and sort of tweak your analysis as you get feedback. The other thing is that sort of detectors are getting bigger and faster constantly. And so with companies like Dextrus constantly producing more and more high-resolution detectors, they're getting much better, much richer data sets out. One of the imaging detectors they have at the Tomcat beamline is able to capture 2560 by 2100, 1500 times a second. And so that produces 8 gigabytes a second of data to analyze. And if you look at data at this rate, any single tool you try to use on your computer, like MATLAB, Aviso, Python, R, is going to be completely overwhelmed in about 60 seconds. And so if you want to be able to analyze this data in a reasonable way, you need to come up with better ways to do it. And when you kind of compare what does this single camera produce on data, it's sort of more information per day than Facebook. And so after GDPR, maybe this isn't true anymore, but certainly before it was. And 3 times as many images per second as Instagram. And these numbers are probably also slightly out of date, but at least from a pure data rate, when you think about all the people worldwide taking pictures on their phones, and that one camera is able to produce as much data as this, it's kind of overwhelming, particularly when Instagram and Facebook have thousands and thousands of engineers working on systems to analyze this data. And at a normal research group, you might have 2 or 3. It's sort of a difficult problem to solve. And so here's just sort of some examples where, the camera we had before was 8 gigabytes a second. I think CSAX, if I'm not mistaken, makes 30 gigabytes a second at the top rate of sort of diffraction patterns coming out. The nanoscopium beamline, I think, makes about 10 terabytes a day. And so that's, of course, different from these because these aren't being run continuously. So they'll be run for maybe a few minutes at a time at most and then stopped. And so with this, it's not as big or not as high a continuous rate, but the amount of data that comes out per day is quite large. And so 10 terabytes of data a day to store and manage becomes quite difficult. There's lots of optical microscopy issues that are running into this. They're still much lower. So even light sheet microscopy only produces around 500 megabytes a second. But if you're analyzing lots and lots of data sets, this is a very large amount to deal with. And when you look at sort of a GoPro 6 Black, it produces 100 megabytes a second compressed. But if you looked at actually the full data set, if you were trying to analyze it in MATLAB or one of these tools, it would be sort of 3840 by 2160 times 60 frames a second. And this is a $600 camera. And so when you see, I think the sort of productions where they try to do that matrix sort of bullet time effect, where you see the cameras rotating, or you can rotate the angle in the middle of a scene. I think this involves an array of 20 by 20 GoPro 6 Blacks recording at the same time. And so it becomes a huge amount of data to deal with. And there's even cheaper projects which can get you cameras that produce 1,000 frames a second. And I think now even slow-mo on iPhones and new Samsung phones is able to produce 960 or so frames a second. And so it's a lot of data. And so if you look at the GoPro by itself, uncompressed, this is about 1.5 gigabytes a second of data that's being spit out, which is 5 terabytes an hour or 47 petabytes a year. And so if you just left a GoPro recording all the time, it would be sort of an extraordinarily large amount of data, particularly when you look at like Facebook's data warehouse in 2014 was 300 petabytes. And so if you left this running for 4.2 years, you have the same amount of data as Facebook, which is kind of an impressive number. And then how much is a terabyte really? And so when you hear these large numbers, it's quite difficult to know what that in fact really means. And so if we take this image from sort of the Hubble Space Telescope, where, you know, this here is this tiny region of interest there. And if you could look at one of these 872 by 1000 by 3 images every second, it would take you 106 hours to view a terabyte. And so even if you were just looking for this image, you know, you couldn't do very much in a second at all. You know, you couldn't count the number of galaxies. You couldn't identify if there was a spaceship or alien life form, because you'd probably have to study each one of those in quite a bit of detail. And so this is a wild underestimate for how long it would actually take to process a terabyte of information by hand. And so it's just kind of an awareness that these volumes of data are incredibly difficult to work with and are well beyond any single person's ability to analyze sort of one at a time. You require sort of much larger, more scalable approaches for focusing your analysis on the things that are interesting and doing everything in a reliable, scalable fashion. So here's some example projects. I mentioned the zebrafish one before, and so this is a full animal zebrafish being measured using synchrotron radiation, where you can see sort of 0.74 micrometer resolution, and you end up with 11,000 by 2,000 by 600, so 20 to 40 gigavoxels per sample. And I think there's a video of this. Is it in? Zebra. Anyways, it doesn't seem to show up or work here, but it's a lot of data. You can see the fish scan through. And so this is just a slow scan through the sample, and that you can see all these tiny little structures there. If you were to zoom into that, would be individual cells. And so this is an entire sort of not just single small embryo object, but a full animal that you can look at cellular resolution. And so that makes it a quite interesting project to work on, because you can see sort of all the different multi-scale of cellular networks to organ systems to entire animals. And so being able to analyze it, connect things together, classify cell types, compare with other types of images makes it quite interesting. And then the brain project, which is sort of run out of EPFL, where they have this whole brain at cellular resolution. So they have 1 cubic centimeter of tissue scanned at 1 micron resolution. And so that makes 1,000 gigavoxels of data per sample. And there you want to be able to register separate scans, compare sort of blood vessel structure, register with fMRI and histology, and do all sorts of other analyses. But it's sort of such a large volume of data that you need a good approach for dealing with it. And so if we were to sort of look at kind of a very simple sample problem from synchrotron imaging, where we have this image here, if you were to count how many cells were in this slice, this would be a fairly easy task. You could go through the image by yourself and sort of count one at a time how many cells there were. This doesn't require a whole lot of complicated analysis. You could do this manually quite well. But if then you were told you have to go back and count the ones that aren't too big or too weirdly shaped, you'd have to start all over again. So you'd have to go back to the beginning, go back to the upper left-hand corner, go through, then maybe you'd make it down to here and you'd have to ask, is that too big or too weirdly shaped or not? And sort of have a discussion with someone to decide if that was acceptable or not. But then you could continue. If you then finish this and someone asks, are there more on the right side or left side? You'd have to start all over again, continue this process sort of ad nauseum. And for a single sample, this is easy enough to do. But as your data sets get larger, this becomes much more difficult. And so if we go here for 96 samples, and instead of just having 1 slice, you now have 2,000 slices. Just a simple task like counting the cells, could take you, I think, a few months to go through all of those data sets and do it. And the cell count itself is probably not particularly interesting. So you'd spend a huge amount of time doing this analysis, and you wouldn't really have the very interesting finding from it. And of course, if you go to other kinds of problems, if you have something like this, where you see kind of aligned, well aligned, not really aligned, when you're looking at sort of the orientation of the cells, because maybe this is important for how strains and stresses are measured in the bone and how well it responds to mechanical changes, then maybe the alignment's a useful factor. And if you use something like qualitative analysis, where you describe kind of, well, not really, this is easy to do. Your eyes are fairly good at coming up with this. But if you now have 100 samples you need to compare, it's going to be very difficult to compare kind of aligned to not really aligned and sort of come up with a reasonable ordering for what's the most aligned and what's the least aligned. And particularly if you give it to someone else, they could end up with a completely different answer than you do about what's aligned and what's not. And so when you see a lot of the imaging papers, particularly in the medical field, they have a lot of statements like this, which seem to make sense and seem to apply to the images, but are incredibly difficult to reproduce and assess and sort of compare between studies and readers in a meaningful way. And so it's important to have the kind of metrics here that you can describe something like this in a way that's not just a nice sentence or a flowery statement, but actually a meaningful analysis. And so now kind of switching gears a little bit over to the more computer science side. So I guess all of you have heard of Moore's Law. Has anyone not heard of it? Okay, so maybe everyone hasn't. Yeah. So it's basically the law that one of the Intel, I think, co-founders came up with in the 70s or maybe even the 60s, that said sort of the number of transistors inside a single computer doubles every 18 months. And so since the early 70s until today, this is more or less held true. He also said some things about the cost going down that has also held up fairly well, but not as reliably as the transistor count. And so what we see is that over the decades, the processing power has kind of always gone up. And if you had a computational problem, the best solution for it was to wait a few years, and computing power would probably be fast enough that you wouldn't need to be more clever with your solution. You could just solve it using an easy way. And so Moore's law has kind of been working for generations, and people have been very happy with it. But one of the problems that's kind of happened recently is that the speed has stopped increasing. And so the transistor count inside computers is still going up. You now have cell phones with 8 cores inside of them. But the speed of a single processor hasn't gotten faster. And so really what this means is that you have a lot more multi-core, multi-CPUs, or multi sort of modality when you look at GPUs, which are able to do things in parallel, but not necessarily do things faster. And what this has really meant is that you can't just rely on computers being faster for solving all the problems you have. You have to think about how you can divide your problems up better so that they sort of are able to be solved by more transistors and not just more brute force computational power. And so when you look at sort of the number of transistors from 1975 to 2010, on a log scale, you have a fairly straight line. But when you look at the clock speed, you see that since even sort of the early 2000s, that speed has not really increased very much. That there were some leaps and bounds sort of in the 90s, but after that, they sort of flattened out and computers stopped getting faster in how much sort of computations per second they could perform. And so now, for those of you who use MATLAB, I guess this code will look maybe a little bit familiar. For those of you who use Python, it's also very similar to that. But basically, if we say kind of what's wrong with the usual approaches. And so all of you have used MATLAB, all of you do analyses, I guess have done them before, or at least familiar with how it normally works. You want to do some kind of analysis with your image, and so you write a little MATLAB script to do it. And so here, maybe you want to filter your image with a median filter. You then make a threshold, label the different things you see in the image, and count how many voxels are in each component. And so don't worry about what any of these steps actually are. Just know that they're sort of common tasks that you perform when you're doing image analysis. And so here you write this little script, imread test.jpg, imfilter, blabel, hist count, and you save the results to a text file. And this works fine for one sample. But the problem you really run into is that if you want to now compare, we used a median filter here, what happens if we use a Gaussian? You'd need to either go back and write a new script or take this script and change it and make sure you change the output.txt file and then open the output.txt file in Excel and then copy and paste the other one and sort of compare and see if that made sense or not. If you wanted to look at 3D images instead of 2D images, you'd have to sort of change the med filter because the median filter right there is designed for 2D images, so you need a different one. And if you wanted to run the same analysis on a whole folder of images, it would be quite difficult because you now have to sort of figure out, okay, what are all the files in the folder that I have? How can I save all the output files? Do I want to do Gaussian and median for all of them? Or do I just want to do it for some of them? How do I compare the results? And you kind of end up having to rewrite everything every time. And if you start with sort of a bad approach, it's difficult to fix. And sort of when you're doing big data and reproducible work, it's something you have to consider from the very beginning. And so it's something you have to sort of think, what are the goals of what I'm trying to do? How might someone use this in the future? And how can I build this in a way that it's easy for someone else to do that? And so now to kind of get into the computer science principles briefly that sort of help us justify why we do all of these tasks in the first place. And so the first thing we'll talk about a little bit is parallelism, and then sort of distributed computing. Then briefly this idea of resource contention. We won't go into too much detail because it becomes very technical very quickly. And then the ideas of sort of imperative versus declarative. And so has anyone heard of resource contention before, or race conditions? No one? Okay. We'll hopefully have good enough examples that it's easy to explain. They're not very complicated concepts, but if you've never seen them before, they can be a little bit tricky to understand. So when we look at parallelism, parallelism is really how can you divide tasks into separate pieces, which can then be worked on at the same time. And so if you look at, for people, we're very good at doing things in parallel. If you have to walk 5 minutes and talk on the phone for 5 minutes, you don't have to walk first for 5 minutes and then talk on the phone, and then it takes 10 minutes. You can do both of them at the same time. And that works fairly well. And so that would be an example of sort of a very easy task to parallelize, that if you're trying to sort of do two tasks that don't require the same organs at the same time, it's very easy. Obviously, if you're trying to talk on the phone and juggle at the same time, that becomes much more difficult because you only have two hands. But there are ways you can deal with that. And so distributed computing is similar to parallel computing, but instead of everything being on the same computer or inside the same head, if you use sort of the human comparison, you now have different people. And so if you think about yourself, if you have 10 different things you need to get done, you can probably do them fairly easily. You know how you do things. You know how long it takes you to do things. And if you have to deal with a team of people and you have 10 things to get done, it's a huge amount of work you spend talking to the different people, making sure they understand what you think they should be doing and that they know how to do it correctly, and having them come back to you when they have questions. And you'll very frequently see that a team of 10 people is much less efficient than 10 times one person, because you have a huge amount of overhead trying to tell them what to do, trying to make sure they have the right resources, and trying to make sure they sort of understand the task well. And the same applies to computers, that when you have everything inside one computer, it's fairly easy. You can do the tasks sort of with the same understanding, the same tool set, the same libraries and resources. But once you have multiple computers, you have sort of network connections you need to worry about. And so is all the data sent? Was that message received? Was it interpreted correctly? What happens if it finishes quickly? What happens if there's a problem? Where did the problem get reported to? And all of those things become much more difficult when you're on multiple different machines than if you're just on one. And so the important part about distributed computing is that it's even more difficult than parallel. And so the issues that you have with parallel are just the beginning, and the distributed ones sort of make everything much more complicated. And so if we look at kind of distributed computing examples, and so if you have sort of 10 friends who collectively know all the capitals of the world, and you want to find the capital of a single country, you can do this quite well because you can just yell out that country and wait for someone to respond. And this is actually how a lot of parallel or distributed processing works, that you have different pieces on different machines, and one just sort of makes an announcement, I'm looking for this, and another one responds, I have this, we can start working on it. If you wanted to figure out who knows the most countries, this would be slightly less efficient, because if you're trying to figure out who knows the most countries, you have to have each person sort of yell out how many countries they know, and you have to listen to each person one at a time until you find the one with the highest, and then you can stop. But you have to listen to everyone before you can decide if that's the highest or not. Can anyone think of a more efficient way to do that?
For example, two people ask each other, and the one who has highest will ask the next person.
Yeah, so that's wildly more efficient. So you just have people pair off, and they talk to each other. And if you have more than the person you talk to, then the person who you talk to sits down, and then you go find who's still standing, and you do this. And then this allows you to sort of go and log to progression instead of going through each person at a time, because people can sort of work among themselves. And sort of one of the challenges of distributed computing is how can you avoid having one central bottleneck where everyone has to talk to this person in order to get your final answer. And so anytime you can come up with tasks where people can talk to each other without talking to their boss, that saves you time. And of course, for in the human world as well, this is exactly the same case. So if you have a boss who micromanages his whole team, and he has to go from one person one at a time to figure out what they're doing and what projects they're working on, things are very inefficient because he has to be directly involved in everything. And if you have a boss who lets you work sort of freely and work with other people on your team well, then you can just talk to the other people you need to talk to and get things done quickly. So of course you can look at sort of other problems like this, where if each friend has some money with them and you want to find the total amount of money you have, you can just have each person tell you and you add it together. Or if we use the approach from above, you just have each person find a partner, tell them how much money they have and sit down, and then each other person find a partner until no one's left standing. But if you want to find sort of the median amount of money, and so if each one of you has 20 coins in your pocket, and you want to figure out what's the median of all the coins that everyone has in their pocket, how do you go about doing that?
The same if you know the amount of people.
What do you mean the amount of people?
You can just make a sum of all the money and then divide.
No, so mean is the sum over the sum of all the values over the number of people. Median is the one in the middle. So there's exactly half that are below and exactly half that are above. And so it's a little bit trickier. And it's actually a Google interview question. So if you have 1,000 computers and all of them have a list of 100,000 numbers on them, how do you find the median of all of those numbers? So of course you can put all of those lists on one computer and sort it and then go to the middle and find it. But that's not very efficient. And so I'll let you think about that longer. And if you come up with the answer, then maybe you should apply to work for Google. The next thing we have is this sort of idea of resource contention. And this is where, when you're dealing with parallel or distributed tasks, that you need to access the same resources at the same time. And so if you're trying to read all from the same image or write all to the same image, and you have a number of different processes that are trying to do this, they can sort of get in fights about who has access to which part of the image at what time. And this becomes very difficult. And so one of the examples of this is this sort of dining philosophers problem. And this is the problem where you have 6 philosophers at a table, 6 forks on the table. Everyone needs 2 forks to eat, because philosophers eat in very strange ways, but they need 2 forks. And then each philosopher takes the fork on their left. So you tell each philosopher, take the fork on your left, then take the fork on your right, and then you can start eating. And so what happens is all the philosophers take the fork on their left, and then there's no forks left on the table, so none of them can take the fork on their right, which means none of them can start eating, and all of them will wait forever and starve, because they only have 1 fork and they can only eat with 2 forks. And so this is kind of the problem, and it sounds funny because obviously any reasonable person would just say, if you put your fork down, then I can start eating, and then I'll give you my fork when I'm done, and this would happen. But computers are exceptionally dumb, and so they would never do this. They would just wait forever for another fork to become available before they would start eating. And so these are the kinds of issues that when you're dealing with, 6 philosophers, maybe it's reasonable. But when you look at sort of the clusters they have at some of the universities, you'll have 30 machines, and each one of these machines has 24 cores. And so you have a huge number of different entities which are all fighting over the same limited resources, and that you want to have a very clear scheme for who has access to what at what periods of time. And if you don't have a good way of dealing with this, you'll end up with lots of these weird issues where the code will just sit there forever and do nothing because it couldn't get 2 forks. And that might be access to network resources, that might be access to a certain block of memory that it needs to process the data, or any number of other things. But fundamentally, these are the kinds of problems you run into when you're trying to do these large-scale analyses. And so with parallel challenges, sort of what this summarizes down is you have this problem of coordination. So you have a bunch of different people who are working on tasks, and you need to sort of or processes that are working on tasks, you need to tell each process what it's supposed to be doing at what point in time. And so how do you coordinate that well? You have the problem of sort of mutability, where you have things that can be changed, and you don't want to have 2 things changing the same thing at the same time, because otherwise it's not clear what would happen. And so the very simple example of that is if you were counting sort of like the number of stars we saw in that picture, and one of the cores goes through and it sees a star, and so it says, okay, the old number of stars we had is 5. I see a star, so I take 5. In my head, I add 1 to it. It's now 6. And now I put it back into that storage. And so now we have 6 stars. But if at the same time that's happening, another core sees 3 stars, it then takes this 5 out, takes it, adds 3, puts 8 back in, and the other computer then puts a 6 back in because it took out the 5 before this one put the 3 in. And this might seem like a very contrived situation, but it's the kind of thing that happens constantly in computers, where you have, if you have 24 cores, they're all working at different speeds, they all have different things they're sort of blocking or waiting up on, and you very frequently end up with something reading something that's stale. So the value is no longer correct because another process has already started to update it. And so coming up with a way of doing this efficiently is very important. One of the simple ways of doing this is called blocking. And so basically you say if there's a number, as soon as I read it, block it so that no one else can write it. And then once I'm done making my changes, you'll be able to write to it. And that's what you'll see with for those of you who use Microsoft Office or SharePoint, that you'll try to open a file and it will say someone else has already checked this file out. You can't make any changes to it until they've saved it and checked it back in. And that, of course, in the same way it does for computers or for people, slows you down because you can't work on the same document at the same time because you have to wait for them to be completely finished. And this is something that, if you look at a tool like Google Docs or Dropbox Paper, is handled very well. You can be working on the same document at the same time, and it sort of updates everything quickly enough that you don't notice the changes. But in general, it's a very difficult problem to solve well. And sort of distributed challenges are everything we had with parallel, plus this problem of sort of sending instructions and data afar. So you have to send commands to different machines, and hopefully they interpret the commands the same way you meant them to be interpreted. Fault tolerance. And so if you have thousands of machines, it's inevitable that one of them is going to have a problem or fail. I think, at least at Google, the last statistic I heard is a hard drive fails every minute inside their computing resources. And so they are constantly dealing with machines that fail and have problems. And having a way that you don't lose your entire search index or someone's Gmail doesn't disappear because a hard drive failed is a very important thing to have solved. And this might not seem like it's as important on clusters, but if you've ever used a scientific cluster, you'll find that other people don't necessarily use them in the way they're supposed to be used. And so when you don't have hard drives failing, but you have someone else logging into the node where your task is running and starting a bunch of web browsers and tabs, and so the machine doesn't have any memory anymore, and that your analysis crashes because they were running something else there. And if your analysis is on 100 different machines, you don't want everything to be unusable because one machine happened to crash. And then finally, how to data storage. When you're trying to access and process data from many different computers quickly without very expensive infrastructure, how can you do that well? And so how can you read in a lot of data? How can you write a lot of data in a very easy way? Is there breaks in these sections? Or
You decide.
Okay.
I think it's probably not a bad idea to have it.
Yeah.
It's
so we can have a break or
fresh air.
sounds good.